What's up, people? I'm Shaggy the Opinionated Hippie, and today I'm going to rank and review-ish, kind of-ish, the Residents' 90s albums. I already did the 70s, and then I did the 80s. Then at the end of the 80s, I put the list up combining the two, which is what I'm going to do here. I'm going to discuss the 5 albums released in the 90s. I'm not doing the 10-hour Hunters documentary soundtrack. I have not heard that. I know it's 10 hours long. I think I know nothing about it. I know it's a soundtrack to a Discovery Channel documentary. But being that it's 10 hours long and I have no experience with it at all, I'm not going to review it. So I'm going to do the other 5 that released in the 1990s. And it's a very interesting 5 because one of them is sort of an outlier. There's sort of a retrospective in which they sort of just interpolate, combine, and sort of Frankenstein some songs in a weird way. And then the other 4 are all pretty similar in sort of like the sort of generic concept, right? And that all 4 of them have like a very strong theme from which all the songs sort of populate that theme. And I mean, it will make complete sense once I talk about them. But the ranking on this, I would put any of these 5. I could see anybody saying, hey, this is the best of these 5. Like, this really goes down to my personal favorite. So I would take this with a lot of grains of salt, if not maybe like a bucket full of salt, only because I think there are 5 really, really strong albums. I obviously prefer some over the other because music is subjective and naturally I'm more drawn to others. I personally am not that drawn to lyrics as much as I'm drawn to music. So in something like The Residents, in which the music has such a dominant effect on one's sort of emotional state and feeling state, and the music is very much goes hand in hand with the lyrics. A lot of these albums I came to love, and then later was like, oh, these are some messed up lyrics. So the music is what made me love the albums, and then the lyrics, which are all pretty strong, yet pretty messed up and pretty dark, are kind of the things that made me like them even more later on. So if you're someone that's drawn to the lyrics, you might have different number 1s and number 2s than I do, just because I think my number 1 on this list is primarily an instrumental, which is why it's number 1. But anyways, that's just a little salt, a little disclaimer before I get into these. So yeah, I'm just going to talk about the 5. At the end, I'll put the list on. And then when I'm done, I will show where I think these 5 fall among all the 70s, 80s, and 90s releases so far. So let's get on to number 5. Number 5 is Our Finest Flowers. This came out in 1992. And this is their retrospective release. That is them. I mean, the Residents don't have greatest hits. I mean, that's a silly notion. I grew up in California, and I don't think I ever heard a Resident song on the radio. Though I do think Dr. Demento dropped a couple tracks back in the day. But they definitely didn't get radio play. So what they did with this one is they took bits and pieces of a variety of different songs and sort of like interpolated them, would be the best way to say what they did. There are a couple instances in which it's like a bass track and the lyrics, but the melody is from this song, even though the lyrics are from this song. There are songs that are on here from like live shows. Like, I think for me, the highlight of this is a track called 44 No More, which is an interpolation of 44 off the Live in Holland QB release. So we got everything's being represented. Snake Fingers albums are being represented on here. And then what else is being introduced? Let's see what else. A lot of Tidal and Limbo, I think, is on here. Some commercial album stuff. You get stuff from Eskimo in the opening track. Freak Show, which came out not too long before this. So you're really getting a little bit of everything on this album. And you don't need to know those other albums to enjoy this. I had this album long before I was able to go, oh, this is from this and this is from this. I think these songs stand on their own as their own songs. And I think it does have kind of a good feel as being like an actual album. Like the 1-2 opening tracks, Gonna Get Into the Sour Song, always remind me for some reason of like a late period Con album. I don't know why, especially that opening sort of like motif that the Sour Song just always puts me in like a late 70s Can mood. I don't know why. But I like this album. I think the second half of it, like from maybe like last 6 7 songs, I think are the strongest. They get a little darker, they get a little weirder. I think maybe the structures are a little more song friendly or like accessible while still being dark. So I think it's a really strong listen. As I got to know their earlier material and the songs that were quote unquote being interpolated, it was fun to like, oh, I know this, and like have those moments. But I don't think it made the album any better. I just think it, fleshed that out for me. But I think it's a strong album. And I don't think the only joy is being able to like spot, oh, what have they done to this one? Or this one is kind of almost an entirely new song. But it's a good listen, and it just seems it's the most like, it just seems almost like a straightforward. If you did not know there was a concept or a theme and you weren't even familiar with the earlier songs, even if you were familiar with the earlier songs, it's like they're not literally taking the parts on them. They're like re-recording them, and some of them they're redoing altogether. So it's a good song listen, and I don't think you in any way need to be familiar with the earlier stuff to really enjoy this. But yeah, it's a strong, interesting album. And I would rank it as my number 5 in the 80s, Our Finest Flowers. Number 4 is Gingerbread Man. And I think these next 4 albums are pretty uniformly excellent. And I am drawn to each one of them repeatedly because over the years, as I get more familiar with the music and I'm actually paying more attention to the lyrics, the stories kind of flesh themselves out. But this is they got into like CD-ROM stuff back in like the in the 90s, and this was apparently one of their first CD-ROM efforts where it was like the music and I believe the CD-ROM were created at the same time for this one, and what we got on the actual CD is sort of the soundtrack for this animated CD-ROM. And the theme of this one is you have the Gingerbread Man is sort of the running musical motif through the entire album. And I'm pretty sure it's every single song. The Gingerbread Man theme opens up the each track. And it almost sounds like that would be really annoying and obnoxious. I mean, it's the Gingerbread Man theme. But it actually, the longer it goes on, and of course the way the residents present the theme, is it just becomes kind of darker and more morose. And because the tales being told here are kind of dark tales, and like the people that they're telling tales about, like these are people who are living like not the most like happiest lives, especially in the 90s. There's one called the Confused Transsexual, which if you were to do that today, it's going to be an entirely different song than something you do in the 90s. This did come out in 95. But I really like that returning Gingerbread Man theme. And it's just that run as fast as you can, but it's like bum, bum, ba bum, ba bum, 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 ba bum, ba bum, bum. I think I missed the Can't Catch Me with Gingerbread Man part. But it's just that basic theme. And there are times when it's just like you're forgetting that it's going to start off a song and it just comes in with this like bum, bum, run, I mean, it's kind of creepy and it's kind of eerie. This album does get props because once I did hear this, and this is about to happen in a couple weeks, when we get to this time of year and I read like 40 different versions of the Gingerbread Man to my kindergarten class, I now will read certain versions, not every version because it drives the kids nuts. But I will read some versions, and when I get to the Gingerbread Man part, I will read it like this. I'll be like, run, as fast as you can. I slow it down, and I slow it down more and more as the book goes on. It drives the kids crazy. They get really upset. Some of them love it. They all laugh. But anyways, yeah, it's an interesting album. It's kind of depressing. I mean, the stories being told are the weaver, the dying oil man, the confused transsexual, the sold out artist, the aesthetic, the old soldier, the aging musician, the butcher, the old woman, and then you get Ginger's lament at the end. it's just neat. I've never experienced the CD-ROM. Apparently, each of these songs has like a whole animated thing that goes with it. I was not into CD-ROMs. I've never been a big computer person. Back in the day when I did all that Zappa stuff online, it was all through CompuServe and it's all text, and I wasn't into like programming or stuff like that. So I don't have much computer knowledge. Obviously, watch the list at the end. It's literally just a Google Doc. But anyways, I think the album stands on its own. It's a pretty good. The tales are dark. It's your typical morbid type Residence type stuff. And I do really think that sort of continuing theme motif of the Gingerbread Man running through it just works, and it just kind of unifies it all together and gives it, a nice cohesion that kind of rewards frequent listens, and it makes it more of a single experience. But anyways, yeah, and it's a rather short album. I think it's like less than 40 minutes, so it's not one of their longer efforts. But yeah, I really like it. And that would be my number 4 in the 90s, Gingerbread Man. Number 3 is Freak Show. This came out in 1990. It was a studio album, and then later on in the decade, I think in 94, they had like an interactive CD-ROM, which was like, again, I think they animated the Freak Show, or you could enter the Freak Show world. Again, I have not experienced that. I do not know that. I am literally just talking about, I think what I have is the CD Freak Show soundtrack. I don't know. I don't have the original CD. I know the original CD essentially is the same songs, but what I have is the later version, in which, like, you have Herman the Human Mole, right? That's one of the Freak Shows. And on the original CD, that's one long song. I don't know how long that one long song is. Later on in the version I have, Herman is broken up into like Herman Watches TV and then Herman the Human Mole. I don't know if those were one track on the original and then were broken up, whether or not the special edition I have has more music from than the original. I don't know that. All I'm saying is I'm reviewing the special edition CD track listing that has like 2 different Wandas and 3 Jacks and a couple Bennies. All I'm saying is this is a great release. It is an over the top, in a way, almost like, okay, of course the Residents are doing a Freak Show. Of course, there's somebody doing a German-esque accent that's horrible and over the top. Of course, we have all these different characters doing all kinds of different, very Residents-esque voices throughout the entire thing. There's a lot of lyrics in this. There's a lot of like really bad, almost Cabaret, the movie, German fake accents that are obviously, I think, meant to be kind of like, oh, that's bad, but it's the Residents. But I think it all works. And even though the idea of doing a Freak Show, I think, is maybe a little obvious, especially for a band like this, it works. They're able to create sort of a musical world that like these characters can live in. Again, there were things about the lyrics, and there were things about the story, and there were things about the characters that are just like rough and dark and unsettling, and they're pushing boundaries and all that stuff you would expect to experience. But musically, I really like it. I think it's almost entirely electronic with like they were into MIDI at this point. I think their soundscapes work fantastic. I think the drum machine use, the MIDI use, all their use of electronics, a lot of these 90 albums are just drenched in electronic music. I think maybe on a couple of these, like, you get some live instruments that seep in, but I think most of this is like MIDI produced, but it works. And I think that's they're able to bring a little bit of warmth to the electronic music, I think. But I do think that like fake warmth that you get in electronic music couples really well with the concept of a Freak Show, which to me seems like a dated, antiquated idea. It seems like that's pre-television, that's pre-movies, that freak shows are generally something of like, the before times, before we got technological advances. So to have something like this in which you're like literally seeped in the technology of the 90s with these MIDI sounds and these electronic sounds, but you're doing something like Freak Show, I think that's a really good pairing. I like the over-the-top German accent. It's pretty horrible. It's pretty cringy at times, but I think it's meant to be that way. It's very much like, hey, you're at a freak show. These are the people in the freak show. Let's meet them. The music fits perfectly. It's kind of disturbing. The lyrics are disturbing. Everything about this, it's dark. It's a freak show. But it's the Residents, and they're able to pull it off. And it's a really good listen. But yeah, that's my number 3 in the 90s freak show. My number 2 is 1998's Wormwood Stories, Curious Stories from the Bible. Though in pure Residents style, we get things like Cain and Abel. We get Abraham trying to sacrifice Isaac. We get a very uncomfortable listen about circumcision. We get somebody seeking John the Baptist's head. Yeah, we get those biblical stories. This is maybe lyrically the best of all of them. The one that is number 1 on my list is primarily an instrumental. It's long. It's like an hour long. I think maybe it goes on like 10 or 15 minutes too long, and maybe it might have jumped a bit. It is a fantastic listen. It is a dark listen. It is the Residents taking a concept and executing it perfectly, mainly curious stories from the Bible. Again, a lot of electronic music. This is the late 90s. They're seeped in the electronic music. And I think just as Freak Show does a really good job of creating sort of a musical freak show environment, as Gingerbread Man has this dark fairy tale telling and soundtrack, the music here reminds me of like images, and I've never been to Israel or to that Middle East part of the Middle East. It reminds me of the movie Jesus Christ Superstar. Just those really barren, desolate landscapes. The music feels like music that would be a soundtrack to those kind of landscapes. And so from the beginning, the album opens up with In the Beginning, which definitely has a more of a chaotic, oh, the world is being created type vibe. But once we get into the actual stories themselves, the music tends to have this kind of barren, morose, stark, desolate, like you kind of feel like you're in, this biblical land, and so then when you get the stories on top of it, the overwhelming effect is kind of overwhelming. And it is kind of like, you're getting a lot of just heaviness. And so when 2/3 of the way through the album or halfway through the album, you get a story about circumcision, and you're just like cutting it and cutting the skin, and you get like specifics. You're just a little like cringy at that point because there's not really much here to like uplift you and lift up your spirits. The Residents aren't interested in curious stories from the Bible that make you want to celebrate. They're into these dark stories and like kind of pointing out sort of the what's going on in this book. It is a fantastic release. I would say that my number 1 is more of a personal preference, and if there was some sort of objective criteria with like what did they want to accomplish, what did they accomplish, I think this album probably ranks as number 1. But as a personal preference, I think there are more instrumentals on number 1, and I think the overall vibe is maybe a little bit more uplifting. But this is a fantastic listen. If you're a hardcore Christian or a hardcore Bible reader, I'd love to know your take on their interpretation of these. I mean, they're not skewing these songs or anything. They're interpreting stories that are in the Bible. So it's true in that it's, there's integrity in that sense. But it's a great listen. It's a heavy listen. I think you might have a different viewpoint on some of the stories. But yeah, it's just great. Opens up with an instrumental in the beginning, closes with an instrumental revelations. You get a whole bunch of lyrics and storytelling and different people doing them throughout it. It's a nice, varied listen. But again, the music I do think tends to there's a starkness and a desolation to it and a barrenness to it that maybe just wears on me just a little. So I'm not as excited to return to this as I am to number 1. But it's a solid listen. But yeah, that's my number 2 from the 90s. Wormwood, Curious Stories from the Bible. And my number 1 from the 90s is 1996, Have a Bad Day. And not again, but I think I have this right. So there was a CD-ROM that they created with a Midway, like a Midway experience called Bad Day on the Midway. kind of a connection to Freak Show, and that maybe Freak Show brings up images of circuses and Midways from like maybe early 20s or 30s. This is a bad day on the Midway, maybe the modern time. And you're not necessarily relegating your story to Freaks because you have a whole bunch of other stuff happening on a Midway. But there was a CD-ROM in which apparently you could explore this Midway. And this is not necessarily the soundtrack to that CD-ROM, but it's music that's inspired by the soundtrack of or inspired by the experience. But I do not believe it's an actual soundtrack. I think there is one song on here which is a song You Just Can't Prepare Yourself, which is kind of, I think, the pivot of the entire album, which I think is the same on the CD-ROM is my understanding. I have not experienced the CD-ROM. I know nothing about it. But this album is fantastic. It is mostly instrumental. Like you'll maybe get one or two lines of maybe like a dialogue or some kind of spoken word part at the beginning of each track. And then you get these mostly like heavily electronic, just sort of soundscapes, like soundtrack, like there's like things are happening. It's not ambient music. But they definitely, you can almost visualize a Midway. You can see like, oh, in this part I've entered the Midway, or it's definitely after dark and I'm creeping around these tents, or like there's a definite unsettling vibe to most of it. But because there aren't any lyrics, or because you really only have like titles, Dogmar, the Dog Woman, I Ain't Seen No Rats, fantastic. Tears of the Taxman, God's Teardrops, The Seven Tattoos. You only have these titles to kind of fill in what's happening, and these occasional people speaking or saying something like, hey, let's enter the Midway, or I'm going to come back there. That was a great experience, or things like that. You really, a lot of it is left to your imagination. Until we get about just to like the beginning of the last third of the album, maybe the end of the second third, we get a song called Lottie the Human Log. And until this point, we've had mostly instrumental tracks, very mood setting, great sound, some really interesting motifs and ideas and themes throughout. But we get to Lottie the Human Log. All of a sudden, we got what, for the residents, is pretty much a legitimate, straightforward song. Kind of a hokey type, I'm Lottie the Human Log. It's very silly, very over the top. You think you're going to get like this carnival sideshow type thing, which is what it is. But then quickly, we realize this is a Residents album. This story is super dark. It's going to continue to get darker. I mean, the title itself, she's a human log. It's just a depressing story. Starts off in real life, divorced parents, or was she widowed or divorced? Anyways, mom starts drinking, gets in an accident. It's horrible. And it ends up being about Lottie the Human Log. Her life is horrible from a kid. When she gets married, bad things happen. It's super depressing. But of course, the music in the beginning is just this over the top. Hi, I'm Lottie the Human Log. It's a female singer being this over-top caricature. It's utterly depressing. There is no way you can prepare yourself for this. Like, if you do not know this, by this point in the album, you're like, this is really good. It's dark. It's a little bit unsettling. I know we're kind of looking behind these Midway flaps and these tents and maybe seeing things we shouldn't see, or like, the wizard behind the curtain is being revealed, but it's not really a wizard. It's just some weird dude with like a lice-filled beard and stuff, right? But then we get Lottie the Human Log, and it's just like, the lights are on, the flaps are up. This is the horrors we've been talking about this whole time. And from that point, you're just like, oh, it's just unsettling. And then as we go through the rest of the album, the following song, Ugly Liberation, kind of a great title because it almost starts off musically almost simpler and straightforward, but everything's a little loud or a little off, or it just feels like it's wrong. And then the song kind of breaks down and we go into these little parts, and it's almost like, oh, you've seen Lottie the Human Log. You're not now free to go home and like get popcorn or cotton candy. Like, now we're taking you actually in, and you get to see the machinations of all this nonsense and ugliness. And yeah, it seems like it's cool at first, but now you get to see the tinkering, and it doesn't help. The song that follows just makes you feel more unsettled and more uncomfortable. And then we get this song called Daddy's Poems afterwards, which we return to kind of more straightforward song material, but it's still, you're not comfortable and it's not good. And then the rest of the album just kind of finishes out like in your equally unsettling way, kind of going back to some more instrumental stuff, but just as We're still kind of experiencing at the end some of the same ideas that we did in the beginning, but because of the Lottie, the human log experience, everything is just darker and more disturbing and more unsettling. A fantastic, fantastic listen. Again, heavy on the instrumentals, which is probably why I rank it as number one. A lot of electronic music on here, but it just sounds, I don't know, absolutely fantastic. And you just can't prepare yourself for Lottie the Human Log. And maybe you shouldn't, because that's part of the joy of the album, is getting to that song and be like, oh my gosh, that's what's been going on this whole time. I'm disturbed. But that's my number one. Have a bad day. I want you to have a nice day, but this is their best album in the 90s, I think. Have a bad day. And those are what the 5 albums look like in written order. The ones I just talked about. I'm sure you remember that. You have a good memory, right? And if I were to put these in with the other ones, I'd have 19 so far. That's what the whole list looks like. Have a Bad Day, I have right between Mark of the Mole and God in Three Persons. I think it falls right in there. Wormwood and God in Three Persons are probably pretty close, but right now I have God higher. Then I kind of alternate Freak Show, Gingerbread Man, then Our Finest Flowers before like those bottom 5, because it's a pretty good album. I reserve the right to change this list as it goes on, but right now I think I'm pretty comfortable with this. Still, those top 5 are all from the 70s. Like that initial run of albums are just like unbeatable. But yeah, I'm comfortable with this. I'd put Have a Bad Day in the top 10, which means it'll probably stay in the top 10 maybe as we go on through the 2000s and 2010s, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. All right. But yeah, that's what my list looks like right now. Anyways, yeah, that's what I got. Let me know what you think of these albums, what you think of all the albums. Just comment. And if you haven't listened to these albums, go listen to Have a Bad Day. It's fantastic. Go listen to any of these albums. The 90s, they kind of hit it out of the ballpark in the 90s. They're not a bad release, pretty consistent, a lot of really strong ideas that I think they executed well. Thumbs up, residents. You get a thumbs up for your 90s run. But anyways, yeah, that's all I got. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, like, share, comment, and go listen to music, people. Go listen to music. Peace. Talk to you later.